Welcome to the Prairie FILES, a true crime podcast. Disclaimer. Please note, trigger warning. This podcast contains graphic depictions of gruesome violence that may be alarming to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
3 men storm into the store in black hoodies and masks, hiding their faces. One armed with a gun, the other holding a chrome machete, the teen carrying a duffel bag.
A delivery man had entered the store and noticed a trail of blood into a back storage room. This was a barbaric and gratuitous act of violence upon 2 innocent persons, resulting in a senseless loss of life.
Constable Phil Obey testified a panic alarm had been hit and the security company had called police.
It is very rare that we see this kind of senseless and random violence in our city.
After court, emotions boiled over in the courthouse lobby. A group of people who were in court for Delorme walked past the Cenabre family. At that point, Cenabre's son seemingly rushed the other group, screaming, and had to be held back by his family. Sheriffs intervened, separated people, and tried to calm emotions. Throughout all this, you could just hear anguished sobs filling the lobby.
2 men are dead following 2 armed robberies, which the police service believes is the 2 robberies are connected. They were armed robberies involving weapons, firearms. What had happened is that
Welcome to episode 4, Gratuitous Evil, on the Prairie FILES, a true crime podcast. The nights start to get long, the daylight dwindles, and the winter stubbornly barges in, regardless if we are ready for it or not. To be honest, living on the Alberta prairies can be a little rough. With the extreme weather the world is experiencing, temperatures here on the prairies can fluctuate from 35 degrees Celsius or hotter down to minus 45 or even colder. It's quite rare that you are comfortable outside, with it being either too hot or too cold at most times. But for 6 months of the year, it is tolerable. We may get a few weeks within those 6 months to enjoy the outdoors. People become grumpy at times and downright rude. But behind all of that, many good people of all walks are just trying to get by. Many with a strong devotion to their faith, and many simply devoted to their 3 kids in hockey. Some people on the prairies have it pretty good during the cold winter days and nights, while others really suffer. It's quite sad, but it's something we expect as we see it every year, not just here, but around the world. What we don't expect to see in our over-apologetic society is extreme violence that we see in other countries around the globe. Not in Canada, you say? Yes, in Canada. Cities on the prairies like Calgary and Edmonton have grown into large metropolitan cities so quickly. And with that comes the horrors and the eroding or dismantling of the sanctity of life. Whether crime is getting worse, I am not sure, as many things have happened over the years that are brutal. But today, things seem to be merciless. I think it's the inability of the average human mind to correlate such extreme violent acts that has become a shield, making most naive and even ignorant to what really goes on. Some places are too evil to be allowed to exist in a place such as Canada. But let's face it, they do. Most will not experience any violence at all in their life. But for many who do, hopefully, they can somehow find peace. In our 4th episode, we go to Sherwood Park, Alberta, Canada, a small hamlet of Edmonton. with about 75,000 people. I would say Sherwood Park is probably one of the safest suburbs there is on the prairies for the average person who wasn't involved in the criminal underworld. It was December 13th, 2015, and a woman named Susan from the US was visiting her friend Chris in Sherwood Park. She was a known video blogger, and at about 10:30 a.m., a sketchy guy showed up at the door knocking. He asked for Chris by name and told her he wanted to talk to him about some business. But Chris was still sleeping, so Susan ushered the guy on his way. Later that afternoon, they came back asking for Chris again. But at this point, Chris had already left to go to his business. The guy left again, and Susan quickly called Chris to tell him about the sketchy guy showing up at the door. She was not feeling safe, but figured it was Sherwood Park. Nothing bad happens here, obviously. Even though Chris asked her he should come back to the house, she hesitantly declined, ultimately talking herself out of the fever. However, not too long after that, around 4 p.m., another knock was heard at the door, except this time it's two guys. I wish Susan didn't answer that door, but that's exactly what she did. As she peeked through just a small slit of an opening, the two guys asked her if she wanted her driveway shoveled. Knowing something isn't right, she promptly declined and tried to shut the door. But before it would latch, instantly they barged in with a fury of strength. She screamed as loud as she could as they slammed the door behind her. Neighbors would later say they heard her screams, but they thought it was something else. Susan instantly fell to the ground, where they fed her some shots, cowardly punches to the face. They took her phone and told her to shut up. A third guy showed up, ran and grabbed a pillowcase, which they would put around her head. They then zip-tied her wrists. Before they covered her face, they were trying to cover her eyes with mitts, but she would get a good look at them, and she'll never forget their faces. She was frantic, but settled down after a few more sucker punches by the scum invaders threw her into a shocked but steady-headed state of mind. If she had started crying and screaming, it may have ended very badly. They aggressively started to interrogate her. Where's the money? Where's the guns? Where's the safe? Remember, she was just a guest in the house, so had no idea if there was even any of these things. This did not go over well with the intruders. They then took her up to the bedroom. I am sure at this point, her heart almost stopped, thinking the worst. The intruders ordered her to lay on the bed face down, but she refuses to accept this, with the obvious running through her mind. So she quickly turtles by kneeling down onto the floor next to the foot of the bed. But she would fight to the death if anybody tried anything like that. You know what I mean. One of the intruders continued to yell, then starts to choke Susan using a sleeper hold. The threats continued as one of the intruders held a 10-pound sledgehammer, which they said they would use to crush her head if she didn't tell them more. After beating on her a little bit more, they took a break from her for a while as they completely ransacked the house, even popping attic hatches and tipping TVs, looking for who knows what. They started getting very agitated and quite frustrated, not being able to find anything of great value. We don't know, but I assume they thought the homeowner was rich because he had a successful business in the area, which seemed to be doing very well. There was some online rumblings about Chris possibly being involved or being associated with these guys, but I don't believe that. There's no evidence to even show that. They then focused on Susan again. Not sure what to do with her, they led her blindly down the stairs into a dark basement, not knowing if this was her last moments. I'm sure Susan pleaded with them. She told them to take the SUV she had borrowed from her father. It was a black Honda Element with a bumper rack, which would definitely not look suspicious. While in the basement, they tied her to a gas line. Frantically went back upstairs when they heard beeping of a refrigerator. Apparently during their ransacking, they had left the fridge open. This spooked them because they had probably never heard or even seen a fridge like this, or one that's even newer than 20 years old in their entire life. This was music to Susan's ears, as they quickly loaded up the SUV and fled with only small electronics. But Susan's camera and laptop, worth thousands, would also be stolen. The main thing is they were gone. After a few more minutes, everything went quiet. She slowly shimmied the pillowcase off her head and was able to somehow bust through the tie wraps. She then ran to a neighbor's house for help, and she called 911 as well as her friend Chris. The RCMP arrived at 5 p.m., just an hour after they barged their way into Chris's house. "There was a gun in the house. I wouldn't be here today. It's horrifying," Susan told CBC News. She also told her YouTubers that if she was down south, she never would have even have answered the door. For unknown reasons, the RCMP didn't or couldn't track Susan's phone or the SUV that was stolen by the intruders. They slipped through the cracks. This inability to locate them would soon haunt the RCMP, as well as every residence of Canada and beyond. Just 5 days later, on December 18th, 2015, that very same SUV, along with two of the same intruders, with a third man who may or may not have been involved in the home invasion, pulled up to the Mac store located at 3208 82 Street in Edmonton, now called Circle K. One of the intruders, Leyland, entered the store first in the Millwoods neighborhood just before 3:30 a.m. Leyland, brandishing a handgun, went right for Bhanghu, who was in the middle of the store cleaning up some displays and organizing. With the gun pointed directly to his head, he quickly pistol whipped him, splitting his head open, creating a long trail of blood leading towards the counter. The other suspects, Colton and a 13-year-old unnamed teenager the court calls GS, entered the store and followed Leyland and Bhanghu behind the till. Colton abruptly approached the counter and popped out a large silver machete. This blade would send chills down anyone's spine. As Bhanghu was held at gunpoint, the others roughed him up and stole cigarettes, lottery tickets, and dumped all the money into the duffel bag. Mr. Bhanghu was fully compliant with the assailants' demands, even after being split wide open from being pistol whipped numerous times. Getting smacked with a handgun really hurts, more than the average person knows. While behind the till, Leyland was telling Bhanghu to open the safe, but he couldn't. It was time locked. This is common knowledge amongst most people. Leyland then struck Bhanghu again, this time extra hard, the gun sending him to the floor. He then picked him up by his hair, dragging him over to the safe again. Bhanghu stumbled over to a compartment down low, which seemed to have rolled coins. I'm sure he was hoping this would be enough to send them on their way. They snatched those up and appeared to be go time. The assailants, who at this point are just violent thieves. The three assailants ran around the counter and towards the door. Thinking it was over, Bhanghu stood up. Head throbbing, he tried to shake it off. Assessing his bleeding cuts on his head, his face, and who knows where. This is when on a dime, Leyland turned the corner, raised his gun, and fired several shots at Mr. Bhanghu, striking him in the stomach, exploding the lottery ticket case. Glass flying everywhere, gun smoke propellant can be seen wafting through the air after the shots are fired. Bhanghu then fell to the floor, rolling around in agony as he started to most likely bleed to death. He struggled for a while, not being able to even get up to call for help. The other assailants can be seen on the store video surveillance system, watching the shooting, then just casually walking out. The robbery only took a few minutes, walking away with some smokes, lottery tickets, and maybe $60 in cash. In my eyes, this is the definition of callous. Police were called out after 3 emergency calls. Bhanghu had actually alerted a silent alarm that he had around his neck during the robbery, which went directly to the security company. The security company then tried calling the Macs, but there was no answer. Police arrived at the Macs at about 3:40 a.m. 3 officers showed up simultaneously, and Constable Phil Obey said Bhanghu was laying there, gasping for air, His eyes were open, but his breaths were very shallow. He tried to administer first aid, but there was not much he could do until EMS could rush him to the hospital. But there, he would be later pronounced dead. Rest in peace, Mr. Bhanghu. The would-be thieves, now killers, bolted into the SUV and would peel out, headed to another Mac store, just to the north, which was about 11 minutes away, for some more of their sick fun. By the looks of social media, these guys love to pretend to be gangsters, and most likely they were looking for blood. Elders would call them skinwalkers. They pulled into another Macs located at 10845 61 Avenue, Northwest in Edmonton at about 3:40 a.m. The Pleasant View neighborhood, which is a beautiful and mature neighborhood with well-maintained homes and newer infill houses. The store sits on the outskirts of the neighborhood. Once again, the killers parked Susan's dad's Honda Element and bolted into the Mac store. Masked and armed, they rushed the clerk, who this time was 41-year-old Ricky Cenabre, who was using his job as a clerk to support his family back in the Philippines. Again, they quickly smacked him around with the gun to show him they mean business. In fact, it got even more rough with Cenabre. But it seemed there had been a huge increase in the level of violence towards the innocent man. The robbery pretty much played out the same. They smacked him around a little bit, causing facial injuries while they scattered about trying to get whatever they can. After taking the cash, cigarettes, and lottery tickets, they began to flee. The difference in this robbery would be the gun changed hands. Leyland gave the gun to Colton this time, just before leaving. It was his turn to wield the gun and play God. As they were running out, Colton passed the counter, pointed his gun over the counter down at Ricky, who was kneeling, and fired multiple shots into his back. As Leyland could be seen watching out of the corner of his eye, he knew exactly what was going to happen and probably felt a thrill trickle through his sick veins. The shot struck vital organs, and Mr. Cenabre quickly started to bleed out. The bullet would pierce his lungs, his heart, and also rupture his liver. The dangerous suspects fled within minutes and headed west towards the Collingwood area in the city's west end. Minutes after they left, a delivery driver came into the Macs and would be horrified at what he would see. He later told the courts that he entered the store to drop off newspapers around 3:40 a.m. and noticed that things were askew. He saw the cash tray from the till on the counter and a trail of blood leading to an area in the back. He told court that he left immediately to get his phone so he could call 911. When he returned to the store, the delivery driver ended up testifying that he followed a blood trail and discovered Cenabre lying in his own blood. He was in bad shape. He was not responding, he told the court. Another woman bundled up for the cold is also seen on the video, looking behind the counter at all the blood and the chaos of objects thrown about. Ricky's body would lay there, on his back, motionless, until EMS would soon arrive and pronounce him dead at the scene.
I mean, like, they got the money, why shoot somebody?
The Edmonton police were able to quickly locate the surveillance video of the robbery and the murders, where they were able to put two and two together and realize what they had on their hands. With a description of the three men, they sent these pictures to all officers in the field. A thorough grid search of the area had started. Meanwhile, the fleeing Honda Element had just exited the Whitemud Freeway at 170th Street, heading south. Then they would turn onto 69th Ave, where they pulled into Collingwood McDonald's, which I actually worked at as a kid. They tried to order some food. The suspects were hungry and needed a midnight snack, apparently. Anyone normal or non-murderous wouldn't be able to eat after committing or even seeing murders like this. This just shows you exactly what these people are. Complete scum. Doesn't matter how many drugs you do, or how much you've drank. Nobody could numb me from murders, especially if I was still alert enough to drive a car and plan where I was going. Leyland, behind the wheel, pulled up to the drive-thru and would yell and scream at the McDonald's employees because they wouldn't give him burgers. It was too early still, and they only had breakfast on the menu. A verbal disagreement ensued between the driver and Natalie, who was the late-night manager, who ended up coming to the window. After dishing out some thankfully only verbal abuse, they ended up ordering some breakfast and drove off, but not before the smart action on Natalie's part. She was able to write down the license plate and call police. She thought the driver might have been drunk, as they were so belligerent. She really had no idea that it was much worse than that, and she definitely had no idea that she had just crossed paths with a killer. The Element, full of skinwalkers, then drove to a third Macs in the next shopping complex, where it was quite obvious they were planning to make their third hit. At this point, if their actions were really to get money, you would think they would have robbed the McDonald's. But they stuck with the Mac stores. These murderers, in my eyes, were simply doing it for the thrill of killing. Fortunately for the next Mac store clerk, who I personally have spoken to on many occasions, the suspects would sit in the idling SUV out front for a little longer, finishing their greasy breakfast. This delay would prove to be life-saving. Up to this point, officers were flooding to many stores all around the city during their grid search to try and maintain the safety of these workers. Some of the stores were even put into lockdown. Luckily for the third Macs clerk, Constable David McCracken and Daniel White were patrolling the West End and were aware of the robberies and murders. McCracken told court later that he had obtained a photo of the suspects from a colleague who had reviewed the surveillance video at the second crime scene. The unique gray jacket with 2002 on it shouldn't be too hard to spot. In the parking lot at the third Mac store, a black Honda Element attracted their attention. But as they approached, they saw the vehicle was idling and the men in the front seat appeared to be eating fast food. The passenger, McCracken said, was wearing a similar jacket to the one in the surveillance footage with the 2002 on the arm. As they pulled in behind the SUV and ran the plates, sure enough, they were stolen. At this point, they probably knew exactly who they were dealing with. They quickly radioed for backup, and before they attempted to make contact with the driver, the vehicle sped off. The officers then engaged in a high-speed pursuit. They raced down 178th Street and entered the freeway going east, down White Mud Drive, reaching speeds in excess of 140 kilometers an hour. They made it to an underpass at the Terwilliger Drive, where the suspects wiped out along the curve under the overpass. They then hit the ditch, coming to a dead stop. Keeping in mind, this is wintertime, the roads are icy. They're lucky they survived the crash. The chase was over, but was it over? There was still a gun in the car. With guns drawn, multiple police units screamed at the suspects to get out of the SUV with their hands up. All assailants cooperated by surprise, and the arrests were made without incident. Constable Dale Mann told court that when he arrested Leyland, who was the driver, he did not appear to be intoxicated by alcohol or any drugs. On the way back to headquarters for processing, Leyland would remain silent and eventually pass out in the back of the cruiser. Luckily for everyone involved, including officers, there was no more bloodshed. In the SUV, they found a bag with all the stolen merchandise, some cash, gloves, masks, and most importantly, they found the gun laying on the floor of the passenger side. All the items were seized. Luckily, no gunfight ensued. I'm sure these cowards were too afraid to try anything like that. The SUV was guarded for hours while forensic teams combed through it, taking DNA evidence and any other forensic evidence. The freeway wouldn't be opened up until 6 hours later. Susan, the owner of the SUV, would be absolutely shocked after learning what the intruders ended up doing in her dad's SUV. Strathcona County RCMP spokesman Constable Chantel Kelly confirmed the Honda Element reported stolen from the Sherwood Park home on December 13th was the same vehicle used in the homicides of the two men at the Macs convenience stores. Authorities have still not admitted that the suspects in the home invasion are the same people now facing charges in the 2 homicides. Susan, on the other hand, is very adamant that the 2 suspects in the Macs killings are also the 2 suspects that committed the vicious assault against her. She's also identified the 3rd suspect through social media. But I'm sure she realizes how lucky she really is to survive the ordeal with such violent people. After spending the weekend in the remand center and getting high fives by gang members, all 3 scumbags made court appearances on the following Monday after the shooting through CCTV from the remand center. Dalen DeLorme, 24, and Colton Steinhauer, 27, along with the 13-year-old boy, are facing a total of 32 charges between them. Because of his age, the 13-year-old boy was in a separate court. The Edmonton Police Robbery Section over the weekend was able to connect the suspects with other recent robberies in Edmonton, so they are facing those charges as well, all without lawyers, as they appeared before the judge briefly. It was put over until January 11th. CTV News saw the records of the teenager, and it shows that he was also charged in connection with 2 robberies and 2 counts of assault with a weapon 2 months before the current robberies. It took a little while, but lawyers for DeLorme and Steinhauer appeared in court on March 10th, 2007, and they settled on dates for the trial. The trial would be 20 days and run between June 4th and June 29th, 2018. Leyland DeLorme, 24, at the time of the killing, was 26 at the start of his trial. There was really no defensive strategy, as the evidence was overwhelming. Even with the insurmountable evidence, he pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder of Cenabre, but would accept a manslaughter outcome for killing Bhanghu. Now that's a stretch. Directly from court documents, the Crown urged that the character of the offender is impacted by his prior criminal record, which includes an assault with a weapon conviction and a theft over $5,000 conviction in 2010, convictions in 2011 for possession of drugs for the purpose of trafficking and failing to comply with a recognizance. A number of other minor offenses in 2011, convictions for assault with a weapon and mischief in 2013. Then, a common assault conviction in 2018. The Crown prosecutor also notes that Mr. DeLorme is a drug addict and a crystal meth user. He's admitting to being in gangs and their activities. The Crown points out the fact that Mr. DeLorme involved his 13-year-old nephew in the subject of crimes. So it turns out the young offender in this case is DeLorme's nephew. What a great uncle. On June 22nd, 2018, a jury would easily find Leyland DeLorme guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder in the December 2015 shooting at 2 different Edmonton Macs stores. He was also found guilty for the robbery charges with a weapon. The jury made its decision in less than 24 hours after deliberation began. Defense lawyer Naheem Rauf, with his rotten teeth and disheveled hair, spoke to media after the guilty verdict and said his client is very remorseful for his actions but can't even remember the shooting. He has very little memory of it because of the drug intoxication at the time of the offense. So remember when DeLorme was arrested? He was perfectly coherent, and the arresting officer did not think he was intoxicated in any way. The defense lawyer went on to say if he really planned to kill him, you would have expected that he would have went back to make sure the job was finished. Comments like this is why people really hate defense lawyers. The next step in the judicial process was sentencing. This wouldn't happen until December, and what it really came down to was whether Leyland would serve 25 years before parole eligibility or 50 years. The justice would have to decide whether it's concurrent or consecutive sentences. In a sentencing hearing, the Crown asked the judge to force DeLorme to serve the 2 murder sentences back to back. This would mean he could not apply for parole for 50 years. He argued his point by comparing previous cases of consecutive sentences, such as the killings in the Baumgartner, Bork, and Garland cases, which all occurred in a similar idiosyncrasy with the same heinous and callous outcomes. While the defense obviously campaigned for a 25-year sentence only, the defense would say, I think there is great hope for him. To give him 50 years or even 30 years was really very discouraging in my opinion, It's cruel, he said. I really don't think he understands the definition of cruel. The jury recommendations were 2 jurors wanted consecutive parole ineligibility, 3 jurors concurrent periods, and 7 jurors made no recommendations. In December 2018, Edmonton Court of Queen Bench's Justice Robert Grazer rejected the Crown's request to impose consecutive sentences, meaning Leyland would only have to serve 25 years before the chance of parole would be granted. Now remember, this is just a chance at parole. He may never get out. The justice said when it comes to his sentencing, a judge must balance the interests of the victims and society to keep everyone safe and secure, while also trying to rehabilitate people who have committed these crimes. The justice went on to say Mr. Delorme has a minimum of 25 years to demonstrate that he has become worthy of some forgiveness. It has been said that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, not the person forgiven. There is, in my view, great wisdom in that. The judge also seemed to bring up the fact how it was ironic in the fact that Delorme's children and family are also victims of his crimes, as he has deprived Cedric, who is Cenabre's son, of a father and the love and support a caring father brings to his children. He has deprived his own children of the same. This next part is very important. The justice said, yet Cedric has the memory of love and support in his childhood, while Delorme continues the cycle of dysfunction so prevalent in the Indigenous community. He seemed to emphasize on his upbringing and heritage despite the violent nature of the crimes. Grazer decided that consecutive sentence would not have been appropriate given the killer's difficult upbringing. I thought it was pretty cold of the judge to bring up that, because there was love with the victim and his son, but dysfunction with Delorme and his son. That was somehow a credit to Delorme. Not really sure where he was going with that. The justice went on to say, I reject drug and alcohol abuse as any excuse. There was minimal evidence of alcohol impairment and no evidence of impairment by any drugs. He went on to say such a crushing sentence would remove any incentive for rehabilitation. A prisoner should have some sort of hope that a sentence will end. 27, at the time, showed no reaction in the prisoner's box as the sentence was imposed. Mr. Delorme addressed the court, expressing remorse for the events that brought him to the court. He apologized to the families of the victims and wished he had not done what he had done. He sought forgiveness, recognizing that it may take a long time to reach that stage. Delorme did not try to minimize his responsibility, but said that the effects of drugs and alcohol greatly affected him. He expressed regret for depriving his victims' families of their loved ones and regretted that he too has deprived his own children of the childhood, which includes their father. Leyland would appeal his sentence, calling it a miscarriage of justice. The prosecution would also end up appealing, as they thought the opposites. The prosecution would say the trial judge erred in the assessment of the aggravating and mitigating factors, and the sentence imposed was not proportional to the gravity of the offense and the degree of the responsibility, and thus for demonstrably unfit. I would agree with him. After the sentencing hearing was over, emotions boiled over in the courthouse lobby following the hearing, as members of the Delorme family asked Cenabre's wife, niece, and 18-year-old son. There was a scream. Then Cenabre's wife and niece were seen physically holding back the visibly upset teenager, Jean Cenabre. Cenabre's wife collapsed to the floor sobbing as sheriffs intervened and tried to de-escalate the situation. Cenabre's niece alleges members of the other group threatened them. They were told to leave the country or something was going to happen to them. Unbelievable. I would not be able to hold back. On December 23, 2021, Leyland's chance at a new trial was denied by a panel of 3 judges. The Crown's appeal had not yet happened. Delorme's nephew was also tried, but his fate would be much different. Even with a checkered past, 13 at the time of the killing, he was 16 when he went to trial. A 16-year-old boy pleaded guilty to manslaughter for his role in the killings. He was also found guilty of 2 counts of robbery and wearing a disguise. The teen, who can only be identified as GS, agreed to being there and was the one holding the bag. Sentencing for the teen then came on November 30th, 2018. The Crown and the defense made a joint sentencing submission to the court, recommending he be sentenced to 3 years in custody. Court of Queen Bench Justice Donna Shelley accepted that recommendation. I hope you will show your remorse for what happened to these families by changing your life, by being a good example to your younger siblings. Standing in the prisoner's box to express remorse for his role in the deaths of the 2 Macs convenience store clerks, GS cried, "I'm truly sorry for what I did. I'm trying to change." The night of the murders, GS and several family members were at a drinking party when they decided to leave and go commit the robberies. He admits that he was under extreme influence of alcohol and Xanax that night. Reports prepared for the court show GS lived his first 8 years of his life with his mother under terrible conditions. She struggled with alcoholism, and using hard drugs was common in front of him ever since he could remember. Children's Services got involved with the family due to concern of neglect, substance abuse, violence in the home, emotional injury, and worries about gang involvement. GS started smoking marijuana at the age of 6. His uncles thought it would be funny. Then he moved in with his grandmother at the age of 8, but admitted he committed crimes behind her back without her even knowing. By the time he was 10, he was already heavily entrenched in the criminal lifestyle and had some respect from his peers while selling cocaine and other drugs at the request of his cousins and uncles. Most of his family was involved with gangs and drugs. The court report states, he claimed he was using cocaine regularly by the age of 12 and began to commit robberies around the same age. In court, Justice Shelley told the youth, "Believe me, what you did isn't a sign of toughness or bravery. I hope you now realize that." The judge praised the teen for the progress he has made in custody. GS told the author of the court report that he was a gang member. According to the report, the teen vowed he would try and keep his distance from gangs once released into the community. But the teen also said he was certain he cannot simply walk away from it without some sort of consequence. I would imagine there's a court order to demand he stays clear of any gang activity or any gang members. This type of talk makes me think we'll be hearing about him in the news in a few years. Or have we already? I don't know. 2 weeks after his sentencing, he was released from the Young Offenders Center and was free. He served just over 3 years in the detention center. He's been given a second chance, and I truly hope he takes it and does something with his life. Next, we move on to Colton Steinhauer. On May 17th, 2019, now 30, he met the same fate as Leyland. A jury of 4 men and 10 women convicted him of 2 counts of first-degree murder. His defense lawyer told jurors, as they deliberated, that there was no evidence at all that there was any plan to kill anyone. But they didn't listen, and justice was swift. Guilty on both accounts. On September 6, 2019, Steinhauer was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years, just like his co-accused. He was also sentenced to serve 8 years for the robberies, but those would be concurrent, so it's basically like he never even did them. Once again, this was appealed by both sides. These 2 cases were essentially identical, so I won't bother getting into any of the court documents. Delorme and Steinhauer were both also slapped with a lifetime ban on firearms, and both had to give DNA samples for the registry. As far as for the 13-year-old boy, I'm not sure if he gave a DNA sample. Whether or not we ever see either of these dangerous offenders get out is up for debate. Sure, they got 25 years, but it all depends on how they act in prison. As far as the victims, I always like to try and say a few words about them. There isn't as much info on these victims as previous victims because they're both fairly new to Canada. I'll start with Ricky. Ricky Cenabre, 41, was born and raised in the Philippines, and he worked a night shift at the Pleasant View Mac store. Like many before him, the Filipino immigrant had come to Canada about 4 years earlier in search of a better life. And he had only now filed paperwork to bring his wife, Edith, and his 16-year-old son at the time, John, to live with him in Edmonton. Cenabre and Editha had been together for 23 years and planned to get married in 2016 once they all settled here in Edmonton. He adapted quite easy, said Pierre Tremblay, who picked up Cenabre from the airport when he first arrived from the Philippines and played host to him in his first weeks in the country. We knew that he would be very successful here in Canada, he said. He was very hardworking. I'd go visit him, he'd be wiping the counters as we spoke. He was very responsible. It was really hard on the Cenabres, as they had no supports here. They were not from Canada, so they were not eligible for victims' compensation. And the WCB money they did get was minimal and would only last for so long. They were also not allowed to work, as they were only here on temporary visas to attend the case, as well as the civil case they had against Macs. There's no updates, but I hope they were able to find their way. A visitation for Ricky was held on Tuesday, December 29th at 3 p.m. at Serenity Funeral Services, where Reverend Nilo Mac would officiate a funeral service for him. Karanpal Bhanghu, 35, the first of the Macs clerks to be killed, died heinously and leaves behind his wife, Karanbir, and his son, Royce. He also leaves behind his mother, who would be completely heartbroken and found it unbearable to go on without him. His mother, weeping, would tell media she sent him to a decent country to earn a living. Had I known, I wouldn't have sent him. Funeral arrangements were made but stalled to allow more time for his family to arrive from India. In some of the cases, his family members were not permitted visas. I am very appreciative of the Edmonton Police Department. They acted very quickly and they saved more people, said Asmir Udal, Bhanghu's cousin. A GoFundMe page was created for the Bhanghu family, which raised over $72,000 for his family. Bhanghu's wife, Karanbir, also set up a foundation called the Karam Project, which fights and lobbies for better protection of night shift employees that are at high risk of violence and crime. He was laid to rest on January 14th, 2016 at Park Memorial Funeral Homes. Money was also raised for the Cenabre family. This concludes episode 4. Thank you for listening. Talk to you soon.